For 10 days, my phone stayed silent. I tried calling my son morning, noon, and night, telling myself he was simply busy. But a mother knows when silence carries weight, when it means something more than a missed call. Each day that passed without his voice pressed heavier on my chest. By the second week, worry had turned into dread. I packed a small bag, wrapped my scarf tight, and boarded the night bus heading north to his city. The ride felt endless. The windows rattled with the rhythm of the road, and outside, the sky hung low and gray. I sat by myself, watching the blur of headlights and shadows slip past. My stomach was tight, my hands restless in my lap. I tried to pray, tried to convince myself everything would be fine. But the longer I sat in that seat, the more certain I became that something was terribly wrong. When the bus finally stopped, I walked quickly through the cold night. The wind cut through my coat as if it wanted me to turn back, but I pressed forward. His townhouse stood in silence, its windows dark. I climbed the steps I had climbed 100 times before, whispering his name under my breath, hoping against hope to hear an answer. But the night gave me nothing back. I knocked softly at first, then louder. Still nothing. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, certain it would be locked like always, but it turned easily in my hand. The door swung open without resistance. My breath caught in my throat. My son never left his door unlocked, not with a young child in the house. I stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that made me uneasy. The living room looked as though a storm had torn through it. The sofa shoved out of place, a mug shattered on the floor, and dark stains spread across the carpet in jagged patterns. I froze in the doorway, unable to take another step. Every detail screamed at me that this was not just a messy home or a busy week. This was the aftermath of something violent, something I was not yet ready to name. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I whispered for my grandson, for anyone, but only silence answered. That was the moment I realized the worst was no longer just in my imagination. Something had happened here, and I was standing in the middle of it. I didn't know yet what I would find upstairs, but a cold certainty told me my life was about to change forever. The house was so still that even my own breathing sounded too loud. I stood frozen in the living room, eyes fixed on the stains in the carpet, when I caught it, a faint sound drifting from above. It was soft, irregular, like something dragging against wood. At first, I told myself it was the house settling, but the longer I listened, the clearer it became. Something, or someone, was moving upstairs. Every step up the staircase felt heavier than the last. The railing was cold beneath my palm, and the old wood groaned under my weight. I kept pausing, straining to hear. The scraping came again, steady now, from the direction of my grandson's bedroom. My heart pounded so loudly, I thought it might give me away. I whispered his name, though my voice barely carried in the silence. No answer. I pushed the door open with trembling fingers. The room looked untouched at first glance, tiny sneakers by the dresser, a Lego tower half built on the rug, blankets neatly tucked on the bed. For a moment, I almost convinced myself he wasn't there. But then the sound came again, from the shadows underneath. I forced myself to kneel. My knees shook as I lowered myself to the floor and leaned close to the gap. That was when I saw him. Liam, curled tight like a shadow, his hair tangled and his skin pale as paper. His cheeks were hollow, his little arms wrapped around an empty plastic bottle as though it were the only thing keeping him alive. His eyes were wide open but vacant, staring past me into some place I couldn't reach. My body wanted to scoop him up, but my hands trembled so badly I was afraid I would hurt him. All I could do was whisper his name and stumble back for help. The next thing I remember was the flashing red and blue lights outside. 2 officers lifted him gently, carrying him through the bitter night air. I followed, stumbling, barely able to breathe. At the hospital, the bright lights and rapid voices blurred around me. Doctors worked quickly, attaching IV lines, checking his pulse, speaking in words that cut deep into me: severe dehydration, malnutrition, psychological trauma. I stood helpless at the doorway, clutching my coat as though it could hold me upright. When they finally let me near, I touched his hand, whispering over and over that he was safe now. He didn't respond. He only clung tighter to that crumpled bottle, the plastic crackling softly in the sterile room. I stayed with him through the night, watching machines measure the rhythm of his fragile body. Relief that he was alive mixed with a deeper dread that I could not shake. Because as I sat there, one question gnawed at me: if my grandson was here, broken but alive, where was my son? There was a time when my life carried a steady rhythm, anchored by the voice of my son. No matter how busy his week became, he always called. Sometimes it was just a few minutes during his lunch break, telling me about a new project at work or a funny thing Liam had said. Other times, he lingered on the line, sharing small frustrations or memories of his father. Those calls were a thread that tied us together, a comfort I never thought would be broken. Now, in the sterile hum of a hospital waiting room, that silence pressed against me like a weight I couldn't lift. As I sat there, I couldn't help but think back to when Monica first entered his life. She had been charming in the beginning: nervous laughter, polite manners, the sort of brightness that draws you in. I wanted to believe she would bring him joy, but over the years, cracks formed. Her late nights, her growing obsession with gambling, the collectors pounding at their door, it all eroded the family they had tried to build. I remember the helplessness in my son's eyes when he came to me for help, ashamed but desperate. He sold his car, drained his savings, and still the debts followed them. The arguments grew louder, more frequent. I visited once and found little Liam pressed into a corner, tears streaking down his cheeks while Monica scolded him over something trivial. My son stood by, exhausted, as though every ounce of fight had already been taken from him. Watching that broke something inside me. When the divorce finally came, I felt relief, as though I had been holding my breath for years. He gained custody of Liam, and for a short while, peace seemed possible. He sounded lighter on the phone, proud even, as he described bedtime routines and Lego projects. It was fragile, but it was hope. That hope shattered with a single call from the detectives. They told me they had examined the townhouse more carefully. Hidden stains in the living room revealed more than what my eyes had first seen. Under special lights, the room had lit up with blood. The words echoed in my head, heavy and unreal. Blood. I tried to argue with myself, to believe there was another explanation. But the detective's voice carried a finality that made my knees weaken. They were treating it as a possible homicide. The thought clawed at me if my grandson was here, alive but broken. Then what had happened to my boy? I sat beside Liam's hospital bed, watching the machines trace the fragile rhythm of his breathing. His small hands still clutched that empty plastic bottle, the crinkling sound breaking my heart every time it shifted against the blanket. For days he had been silent, his eyes locked on a world far beyond my reach. I whispered to him, sang the lullabies I once sang to his father, anything to remind him that he wasn't alone. Slowly, he began to stir, his lips trembling as if the weight of his memories was finally too heavy to hold inside. At first, it came in fragments. He spoke of the rain pounding against the windows that night, the way his father's face had tightened with worry as the doorbell rang again and again. My son had bent down to him, urging him to hide under the bed and stay quiet until it was safe. I could almost hear the urgency in his voice, though Liam's words were broken and halting. Liam described the narrow gap from beneath the bed where he saw everything unfold. Monica entered with a tall man he didn't know. Their voices rose, sharp and full of anger. She demanded something from his father, her words twisting into accusations about money and debts. My son stood his ground, refusing to give more. Then came the moment that changed everything. The tall man shoved my son once, then harder the second time. Liam said he heard a crack as his father's head struck the corner of the table. He lay still on the floor, and no one rushed to help him. My grandson's voice faltered as he recalled the sound that followed the heavy scrape of something being dragged across the floor. The voices fading, and then silence. As Liam recounted it, tears streamed down his cheeks, and he pressed his face into my arm as though he wanted to disappear. I wrapped him close, my own tears falling freely. The image he painted cut through me like a blade. My boy had died not in some accident, not in a way that left room for hope, but in violence, in betrayal. And my grandson had been forced to witness it all from the shadows. In that moment, sitting in the cold hospital room, I realized the nightmare was far darker than I had feared. My son was gone, and the little boy beside me carried the truth of it in his trembling voice. I knew the detectives would need to hear every detail, but all I could think about was how to protect what remained of my family. The days that followed felt like living in a shadowed blur, but I remember how the detectives moved quickly after hearing Liam's trembling account. His words had been raw, pieced together like shards of broken glass, but they carried a clarity only truth can hold. They began matching his memories to whatever evidence they could uncover. And slowly, the nightmare began to take shape outside of his fragile voice. The first breakthrough came from a grainy clip pulled from a security camera across the street. At 2:30 that morning, headlights swept across the rain-slicked road. A dark truck paused outside my son's townhouse, its outline matching the vehicle Liam had described through his sobs. I stared at the footage with a hollow ache. It was proof cold and undeniable that strangers had been there, intruding on the last moments of my boy's life. Not long after, one of the neighbors finally stepped forward. She admitted she had heard shouting that night, raised voices crashing through the storm, followed by a thud so sharp it lingered in her mind. She had convinced herself it was none of her business, but now, with a child's testimony on the record, her silence lifted. Her words burned in me. My son had been fighting for his life while others turned away, and my grandson had hidden in the dark, carrying that terror alone. The final blow was the discovery of the life insurance policy. The detectives laid it out like a cruel puzzle piece, Monica listed as the sole beneficiary. The payout larger than anything my son could have left behind on his own. It was as though the ink itself had sealed his fate. My heart clenched with fury and sorrow, knowing that his devotion to providing for his family had been twisted into a motive for betrayal. Each piece of evidence tightened the noose around Monica and her accomplice. Yet none of it brought me comfort. Instead, it deepened the bitterness that sat heavy in my chest. My son had worked so hard to protect Liam, to shield him from the chaos of his mother's choices. And in the end, that very sense of responsibility had painted a target on his back. As I left the precinct that evening, I felt both the faint stirrings of justice and the cruel irony pressing down on me. The truth was surfacing. Yes, but it came at the cost of a life that could never be replaced. And I knew, deep down, that the most painful discovery was still ahead. When the phone rang that morning, I almost didn't answer. My body was heavy from sleepless nights at the hospital, from watching over Liam as if my presence alone could shield him. But something in me knew that call was the one I had been dreading. The detective's voice was steady, but the words struck like a blow. They had found my son's body. For a moment, the world around me dimmed. The sterile hospital walls, the faint beeping of machines, even my own breath, it all blurred into silence. I held the phone so tightly my hand shook, unable to release it, unwilling to accept what I was hearing. They told me he was discovered near a half-finished construction site, abandoned and forgotten. I pictured him left there, alone, surrounded by nothing but rusted beams and cracked concrete. The cruelty of it twisted inside me. He had once been a boy who laughed while chasing fireflies in our backyard. A man who worked tirelessly to provide for his son. And yet, this was where his journey ended, discarded, as though his life meant nothing. The detectives spoke of evidence, and though their words were measured, each detail lodged like glass shards. Blood traces found in the truck, fibers that matched the blanket taken from his living room, footprints in the dirt aligning with Monica's shoes and those of the man who had helped her. The pieces fit together too neatly, too painfully. The woman who had once stood in my kitchen, nervous but smiling, who held my grandson in her arms and swore she would love him, she had orchestrated this. She had turned the man who loved her into nothing more than a liability to be erased. I tried to breathe, but each breath felt like swallowing fire. The betrayal cut deeper than the grief itself. I had prayed for my son's happiness, trusted in his choices, supported him through every trial. And now, the mother of his child had been the one to bring about his end. It was a truth too jagged to hold, yet it pressed against me with crushing weight. That night, sitting beside Liam's hospital bed, I looked at his small hands curled around a toy car, his fragile chest rising and falling with sleep. How could I ever tell him? How could I explain that the father who had protected him until his last breath had been taken from us by the very person meant to be family? The thought of shattering his innocence, of planting that darkness in his heart, left me breathless. I stayed in silence, holding his hand as if it anchored me. My son was gone. The betrayal was complete, and the trial was yet to come. The morning of the trial felt heavier than any I had lived through. Liam's small hand clung to mine as we stepped out of the car, and I could feel the tremor in his grip. Reporters and strangers filled the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing, their voices colliding into a blur of noise. To them, it was a headline. To us, it was the most painful walk of our lives. Inside, the air was thick, weighed down by tension. I sat beside Liam in the front row, every breath a reminder of why we were there. My son was gone, and the people responsible for it were just a few feet away. I could not look at Monica without feeling the sting of betrayal pierce straight through me. She once held my grandson with tenderness. Now she sat in chains, her face set in stone. The prosecution began their work, piece by piece, pulling back the curtain on what had happened. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the evidence. Photographs of Aaron's home, the carpet stained with blood. The security footage of the truck idling in front of the house on that stormy night. Each detail tightened the noose around my heart, and yet I knew these truths needed to be seen. Then came the recording of Liam's testimony. His small, fragile voice filled the courtroom, recounting the moment his father told him to hide. The sound of the argument, the shove, and the silence that followed. I felt my body tremble as his words spilled into the open. Words no child should ever have had to carry. I glanced at him beside me, his eyes fixed on the floor, too young to bear the weight of such memories. For the first time during the trial, Monica faltered. The evidence pressed in too tightly. The mask she wore began to crack. I saw her shoulders shake, her face twist, and in a moment of collapse, she revealed her guilt. The accomplice at her side lowered his head, no longer hiding behind denial. The truth, so bitter and so cruel, was no longer in question. The verdict came at last guilty on all counts. A quiet ripple moved through the room, but inside me there was no celebration, only a fragile, aching relief. Justice had spoken, yet justice did not bring my son back. I held Liam close as we left the courthouse, his small body pressed against mine. Reporters shouted questions, but I had no words left to give. All I could think of was the long road ahead, the nights of fear, the slow rebuilding of trust, and the heavy task of teaching Liam that love could still exist after such darkness. Justice was won, but the real work of healing had only just begun. When the trial ended and the courthouse emptied, I walked out with Liam's hand in mine and felt the silence settle around us. It wasn't victory I felt, not really. Justice had been served, but justice does not fill an empty chair at the dinner table. The house felt different when we returned quieter. Heavier, but also, in a strange way, relieved. The long fight was over. The first few mornings were the hardest. I would wake expecting another phone call from detectives, another meeting with lawyers, another headline in the local paper. Instead, there was stillness. Liam sat at the kitchen table with his cereal, and I realized that ordinary life was what we had been waiting for. It didn't come rushing back. It crept in slowly, through small rituals. The smell of toast, the sound of the radio, his shy laughter when I burned the eggs. At night, he still woke from nightmares, and I would sit beside him, stroking his hair until he drifted back to sleep. The scars don't vanish just because a judge says guilty. I saw his father's eyes in him, the same way he furrowed his brow when he was concentrating, and that recognition cut deep. Yet it also gave me strength. My son lived on in the boy who now needed me more than ever. We built a new rhythm. Saturday mornings at the park, his sneakers pounding against the pavement as I cheered from the bench. quiet evenings with puzzles scattered across the table. We laughed again, softly at first, then louder, until the walls of the house no longer echoed only with sorrow. Each smile was hard-won, but each one mattered. I still carry the bitterness of betrayal. I still ache when I remember where my son was found and how carelessly his life was taken. That wound may never close, but alongside it, I've discovered something stronger: resilience. We are not defined solely by what was done to us, but by how we choose to go on. If there is one lesson I hold on to, it is this: love endures. It carries us through trials no court can see, through nights darker than any storm. It is what allows a grandmother to rise each morning, what allows a child to smile again after unspeakable loss. As I share this story, I hope it reaches someone who needs to hear it. If you've known grief, if you've carried scars that seem too heavy, know that light does return, little by little. And if this story touched you, I ask you to share it, to leave a comment, to pass on the reminder that even after the storm, love remains.